I just first wanted to talk about why I love using archival materials and basically how I got started doing that. I think while I love narrative filmmaking, it is extremely time intensive, labor intensive, financially intensive, and sometimes I just have like an idea it's like a little idea or like a little thing that I want to play with. And I find that using archival materials is like, it's extremely accessible. It's really cool because each person interacts with each image in a totally different way. So even if you're working from the same database of images, you will end up with completely different works from completely different people, which I just love that process. And I've tried a lot of different things over the years. When I was in graduate school, we were the last class to still shoot on film, which makes me sound older than I am. That was only in like 2014, but they sort of like phased 16 millimeter out after my class graduated. But I remember being in the basement, because that's where the film kids are always put, and working with just the physical celluloid. We had a bunch of we just had a bin full of it, and we got to like burn and do weird things to this physical material, which was really exciting to me and sort of opened my mind to all these different ways that you can use images, especially as someone who's more trained in the sort of like 3-act narrative structure, traditional filmmaking. I found it like very freeing to have more of sort of like an art practice modality towards that. So welcome. I'm very excited to do this presentation and just talk about something that I really enjoy doing, and my process and sort of like the ways that I developed to think about it. It's nothing like this is just what I've come up with. The stuff I've learned in school was much more theoretical than this is. This is much more practical, because that was always my favorite part. So I'm going to show you my screen and make sure that it is optimized for video, because you know we love video. Oops. Sorry, I just re-updated my computer and apparently I have to redo something. Okay, come on, Zoom. Sorry about that. All right. Oh. Let's see if that worked. Sorry, like a new operating system, which apparently has more security features, which would seem great, but is actually not. Okay, let's see if I can do this now. All right, here we go. Optimize video and share. Perfect. Okay, so here's my little slide deck I made. Okay, so archival revival and experimental techniques. I am mostly focusing on this through the archival lens, but I do also have in tandem different ways that experimental filmmakers are using the sort of different ways, methodologies that I talk about. This is just my little info page if you ever want to get in touch with me after this or see what I've been working on. Paradise already did a great intro of me, so I don't have to go into this as much, but I just wanted to just also say thank you to Elsewhere Studios for introducing me to the lovely people at Paradise Theater. I'm very excited to continue working with you all. One of the things I always want to ask when I'm making experimental work is, what is the experiment? I got this question from a woman after an experimental theater piece I went and saw in New York many years ago. There was a Q&A afterwards, and this older woman came up to the podium to ask her question, and her question, which like sent everyone into like an existential crisis, was, what is the experiment? And I think maybe they hadn't thought about it, or they were thinking about experimental, like really high level, but they couldn't answer the question. They couldn't answer what the experiment was. So I always love to ask myself, like, what is the experiment? What am I trying to do? What am I experimenting with? I think it's also a really fun way to generate ideas, to be like, I want to experiment with sound, or I want to experiment with, you know, the idea of, like, you'll see from my work, like the idea of how female secretaries were portrayed in the 1950s, or, you know, something super specific, gender performance, and to think about what's the experiment that you're doing. So here are some of the ways that I've developed for looking at an image. This is, in my case, usually a moving image, although there's a lot of cool experimental work that's done with still photos. So that is another way of doing it. So I usually look at it first as a material object, as a historical product, as a personal story, and then in the context of what it means now. There are obviously many, many more ways to look at it. And as you develop your practice, you'll come up with your own ways of looking at things, which is really fun and exciting, I think. I think one of the cool things about being an artist is that not only do you make art, but you develop your own theories and practices around art. So we'll go through these sort of step by step and talk about them. So one way to look at things as a material object. This is a little bit easier when you conceptualize film as a physical thing, as physical celluloid, but it also does work with a digital file. You can still manipulate digital files as the file themselves. That's how we get all this glitch art. And you can manipulate the audio portion within any digital file. So I've made pieces where I just completely took the audio out and like redid that part of it. But you can also do a lot of other things with the audio, depending on what you're thinking about with the sort of theory behind your work. And one of the things I like to think about is, like, what does it mean when you alter the images in these different ways? Like, if you burn something, if you burn a piece of film, that means something really different than if you are watercoloring it, or if you're, you know, glitching a file. Those things all have different meanings behind them. And sometimes we do it just because it's fun and you want to play, but it's also really fun to think about the sort of the inherited meaning behind all of those actions. Some places to find old film, if you're interested in working on celluloid itself, estate sales, sometimes at thrift and junk stores, college sales, by which I mean, if colleges are closing some of their departments, this happens at community colleges a lot, they'll sell stuff off. And then eBay. eBay is a shockingly awesome place to find lots of old film. So I have a couple examples of messing with the materiality of the film. One of them is my piece that I made using mostly training videos for secretaries from the 1950s, all of which I found online through the Pellinger archives, which you can access through archive.org. And then I'm also going to show Mothlight, which is a very famous piece by Stan Brakhage, which I can, after I show you, I can talk a little bit more about how that was created. So first of all, I will go into, I'd like to thank my wife. And then I can tell you a little bit about the process behind making it, which is the nice thing about sharing your own work, because I actually know how I made it. Sorry, let me try reloading.
I typed this under considerable pressure. Considerable. Well, you see, I typed it, and I retyped it, and
I'd like to thank my wife.
Well, I typed it again. I did all this with 2 aching fingers. I have typed and retyped the entire manuscript.
I would like
5
to
times
thank
at least.
my wife.
At least 5 times. I have cheerfully typed 250,000 words. I
I'd
proofread
like
everything.
to thank my wife.
All of it. Every last chapter. With 2 aching fingers, I typed out the entire
I would like to
manuscript.
thank my wife.
You know, it's the entire thing. I worked with the black type that was, well, it's from the 16th century. It wasn't easy, but I also, after I did that, I also did the punctuation and,
I'd like to thank my wife.
proofread everything. It was a lot.
I'd like to thank my wife, my wife. I'd like to thank.
So that's a piece I made as part of a little like experimental film collective that I was part of in LA. And it's fun to use as a case study because I love watching other people's work, but I have no idea how they made any of the decisions behind it. And I can actually walk you through what I did and why. The inspiration for that piece was a Twitter thread of all things, which is hilarious because I'm not even on Twitter. But I saw this Twitter thread that this guy had written about the acknowledgements pages in books and how all of these, they were mostly academic. All of these academic men had thanked their wives and sort of like written out what their wives had done. And like what their wives had often done was like extreme amounts of research or like basically all of the work, or had typed and retyped everything. And it's interesting because when I was in grad school, I was dating someone who at the time got like a big book deal and got published. And I remembered that I like had like this flashback to that moment of being like oh no. And it made me, I was like kind of haunted by that idea and just thinking about the ways in which women are often sort of like in service to someone else's idea, like the handmaidens of an idea, or in this case, the secretaries. So I was looking for imagery that was, I think I originally started looking for housewives for this piece, but found so many great training videos for like how to be a secretary, which apparently is a thing that existed and was very popular. So started thinking about like the ways in which secretaries are like integral to business, and the ways in which they support everything that happens, and the ways that like, oh, that's what kind of what these women are doing as essentially secretaries to their husbands. Sorry, my cat is crying because I'm not paying attention to her. But anyways, so I started going through all of these old training videos and just like picking out pieces that I was interested in. And I had this idea of taking the audio out and then basically dubbing in what I wanted them to be saying, because that was the experiment I wanted to do. I wanted to see how that would work and if it would be fun and if it would like be disconcerting and kind of weird when you watched it, slightly off-putting in the way that being constantly interrupted is also slightly off-putting, which I also used in there. So I found all these images that were sort of what I wanted, recorded my audio track that was like me dubbing in what I wanted to be said, and then trying to match closely, not super closely, but close enough that it was like that you were like in the uncanny valley a little bit, people's mouth movements to that, and then redubbed it in. So I was like dubbing to their mouth movements, which was a very, I don't know if that's a real process that people use, but I used it and it worked for what I wanted to do, which was really fun. And that piece was like taking the sort of material nature of the audio and messing with it. I didn't do anything to the images. The images remained because I loved what the images already said. You know, the images already had all of these layers of like, what does it mean to be a secretary? What does it mean to be a woman in the workforce? What does it mean to be a woman who makes work and supports people and is never recognized and has like I mean, I guess they have Secretary's Day, but like if you need a day, people are not recognizing you. It has to be like mandated in there. So I left that as is because that was saying what I wanted it to say. And then I changed the audio because I wanted that to say something different. So that's an example of like changing the materiality using the audio. A lot of other people will change. You can change the video in a variety of ways too. You can add layers. You can change the color. You can do multiple layers that you can kind of see through, which looks like old school optical printing, but is much easier than that. Yeah, just really thinking about like, what is the piece that I want to change and what do I want to change it to? And like, what are the pieces that I want to remain, because those are already working on the level that I want them to. I'm also going to show you really quickly Mothlight, which is very, very different. And I can also talk a little bit about how that is made, because it's very simple. Like you'll see once I show you. It's an example of much more abstract work, which is cool and very fun, and is not exactly what I do, but I think is a really interesting way to think about film and to divorce it from the narrative structure that we're so used to it having. So I'm going to show that really quickly, and then we can talk about it. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to ask at any time. You can raise your little hand. Not your actual hand, but the little button if you're interested. Okay. All right, got Mothlight up. And we're going to share. Okay. It's also silent, so don't worry. that's Mothlight. It's a piece I think is just extremely beautiful and very weird. It's also one of those funny things where experimental work that was so revolutionary at its time now is the kind of work that would like be projected at the back of like an Instagram pop-up. Just like the ways in which these like beautiful sort of ethereal things become mainstreamed. Also, like a lot of MTV music videos back in the day were pulling from experimental artists or were made by experimental artists. So there's a lot of crossover between those worlds. And this piece, especially for me, the first time I saw it, I saw like an actual print projected, and it's just so, it's such a different way of thinking about film and what it can do. You know, it's actual moth wings taped down onto a piece of celluloid and like different little pieces of nature. And, you know, it has this, I find like a hypnotic sort of like experience for me, and like weirdly soothing. It's like it's a meditation in many ways, and really forcing you to look at pieces and parts of nature in a radically different way than you would ever look at them before. So that's a great example of using the materiality of film, especially the image itself, to experiment with form and to try something new. I mean, that's a piece you could just like loop on your wall over and over again and be like, this is like my piece of art, which I just love and think is so interesting. I'm gonna go back to my little PowerPoint and we'll talk about, ooh, there's questions. Yes, absolutely. More of a subconscious effects than when you're filming that item. Yeah, it really does. And it also has more of a sort of puzzle to it. You don't immediately know what everything is. Still has like a little bit of mystery left. All right. So another way that we can look at these archival images as a historical product. I think that's really important to do when you're using archival, especially because it has a life all of its own before you encounter it. And it's really useful to think about how the image is situated in a specific history, especially if it's one you don't know much about. And is that a history that you are trying to explore? Are you trying to subvert it? Do you want to recontextualize it? Do you want to make it your own? Are you trying to distance yourself from it? Like what is its history, and what is your relationship to that history? Some of the things I ask myself when I'm doing this kind of work are, how was the image made and why? What did it mean when it was made? What might it mean now? Considering all of it, every time passes, meaning also changes. And how do you want it to mean? How do you want to put your own mark on it and change the meaning of it? So I have a couple examples of this. I won't play them all. Sans Soleil is a feature film, and its magic is about 4 minutes long. But Sans Soleil by Chris Marker is a very famous piece of filmmaking in the experimental world. It's essentially an experimental documentary. It uses archival images and some filmmaker created images to create this story. It also contains these sort of like fake letters that were written back and forth. It's a really interesting piece. And then I found this other piece by an artist collective, and the piece is called It's Magic. And I wanted to show this one because it thinks of the archive not just as like sort of miscellaneous pieces in an actual archive, but it uses images and editing from horror films. So it draws from a specific genre, which I thought was very interesting and cool to sort of comment on that genre. So I'm going to show a little piece of Sans Soleil. just the very beginning of it, and then I'll show part of People Like Us. That's the collective that made It's Magic.
The first image he told me about was of 3 children on a road in Iceland in 1965. He said that for him it was the image of happiness, and also that he had tried several times to link it to other images, but it never worked. He wrote me, "One day I'll have to put it all alone at the beginning of a film, with a long piece of black leader. If they don't see happiness in the picture, at least they'll see the black." He wrote, "I'm just back from Hokkaido, the northern island. Rich and harried Japanese take the plane, others take the ferry. Waiting, immobility, snatches of sleep. Curiously, all of that makes me think of a past or future war. Night trains, air raids, fallout shelters. Small fragments of war enshrined in everyday life. He liked the fragility of those moments suspended in time. Those memories whose only function had been to leave behind nothing but memories. He wrote, "I've been around the world several times, and now only banality still interests me. On this trip, I've tracked it with the relentlessness of a bounty hunter. At dawn, we'll be in Tokyo." He used to write me from Africa. He contrasted African time to European time, and also to Asian time. He said that in the 19th century, mankind had come to terms with space, and that the great question of the 20th was the coexistence of different concepts of time. By the way, did you know that there are emus in the Île-de-France? He wrote me that in the Bijago Islands, it's the young girls who choose their fiancés. He wrote me that in the suburbs of Tokyo, there is a temple consecrated to cats.
So that's just a very small portion of a very long, interesting, meditative film, written as a sort of travelogue. And now I want to show you a little bit of this piece, People Like Us. I'm going to show you from where it really starts going. There are horror images in this, so just beware that there's guns, creepy masks, a little bit of a content warning. It's not super gory, but it is definitely a little bit weird.
What can I do when I can never go home again? I say no.
still astounds you each time you look at a star.
Okay, so two very different pieces, which definitely wanted to share the second one because a lot of experimental work ends up being, for whatever reason, a little bit more like poetic and contemplative, partially just because of the traditions of making behind it, but that definitely is like not what you have to do. You could do something totally wild, like layering a bunch of different songs on top of each other and creating this like very chaotic feeling. So I wanted to talk first a little bit about Sans Soleil and the Chris Marker piece, and how it's like extremely self-referential and gets very meta. And there's just like a lot of different layers to it. There's these letters that this woman is reading. There's all the different images. There's also this sort of like meta commentary on like how the images are going to be used. And just really thinking about how, especially because they're in that piece, I think all of the images except for maybe one moment later in the film are all stills. So you don't necessarily even have to have a moving image to create a film. You can create a film entirely out of still images and using those and really thinking about how they're working, and then you can add this extra layer of meaning on top of them to tell this story that you want to tell. And then the second piece I think is so interesting because it uses things that were already made in the language of film, and mashes them all together, uses the sort of like frantic cutting in a lot of places of a horror film, or like now of what we would think of like as a Michael Bay film, or like a big action piece where you don't know where you are. Like it's just the 180 rule has been broken. It doesn't matter anymore. Like you're just all over the place and the world is chaos. And then also combines that with these longer, slow suspense shots of the girl waking up and the girl walking. And that one kind of places you a little bit as a viewer in the sort of like persona of that girl waking up in bed and exploring this world, which is a thing that you can do. You can definitely use archival footage to create characters. One of the exercises I have later on for people to do on their own when you have time is to, instead of designating one person as your character, is to think about, if you're creating a character, maybe it's through writing or through performance if you're an actor, to make a short archival piece that describes that character without ever telling you, like, without ever being like, that person is the character. It's a really interesting way to do it. As for the archival images and are they copyrighted, that is a very good question. Some of them definitely are. If it's The Shining is copyrighted. I think you can get away with a fair use argument for some of those, but also considering that if you're not shown in a gallery, the commercial value of your work is probably not enough for them to come after you. But it is something to consider when you're pulling from from films and TV shows. But as for the archival work, a lot of those are under fair use or Creative Commons licenses, or no longer have a copyright on them, either because they're old or because the entity that made them doesn't care, and didn't care to renew their copyright. So you can definitely look in the public domain for archival images and videos. There's lots of great resources. I think I have a research page later on that I can get into. So yes, some of the images are copyrighted, but there are many, many images that are not copyrighted that you can use, essentially, as long as you're not making a lot of money off of them. And then some you can use and make money off of because they have no restrictions. So good question. There's a variety of places in between. All right, what time is it? Okay. So one of the other aspects that I wanted to touch on and ways to use things, I'll go back to my presentation really quickly. So one of the other ways to think about archival images is as a personal story. And as personal materials. So some archival is just, you use it to, you're a documentary filmmaker, you're making a piece about, say, Wild Wild Country, the Wild Wild Country piece about the probable cult in Oregon. And you want to use the archival images of the people in that story. So you're going to use archival to tell a story about your specific subject, that's also the subject of that archival. You can also use archival that is not specific to that person to tell a story. You can use archival footage to contextualize somebody's life, to give us a sense of the time period they lived in, or the world that the specific world that they lived in. And also something that's really interesting about work like that, especially if you have like an organization that made work about itself, is thinking about really why did they make this, and what were they trying to do at the time with this work. I also like to think about the political context of the image, made when it was made at that time, and what does it mean now. And then reinterpreted image. So what is the story that you place on the image? What is the story that you are telling yourself about, back to the piece that I made about these women in these offices, what is the story? What are the sort of characters that I'm making out of them? And who are they standing in for, and what ideas might they represent? It's a way of sort of using archival images to do some character work and to think about the sort of stories and ideas that you put on those images too. One of the big things that I like to think about is what the images mean now. Sort of what are the contemporary, I always have to sort of check myself and say oh, some of these ideas that I have about these images are definitely from my time, they are not from that time. And it's interesting sometimes to explore the gap between those two things, and to see what comes out of that. And I try not to just assume that I know what the images mean, because I think you can lose a lot of interesting, I guess, richness, but also just you can lose a lot of interesting context when you don't do your research or don't really think about how they were originally created. One of the things to really consider is that images have meaning long before you arrive. So they mean something separate of you because they're created in a culture. And how do you really work with that meaning to make it yours? How do you essentially collaborate with this image and the meaning that it already has? My little eyeball. So one of the things I also wanted talk about in this piece was my process of making. I got into it a little bit earlier when I gave you my case study of getting obsessed with the Twitter thread of all things. But I think it can be sometimes overwhelming to think about starting to use a new medium, or it just seems impossible to get started. So, which I know I have felt before when I have started to do new things. So I just wanted to tell you sort of like what my process is for making archival work usually. And as you can see, my process is easy, or it's simple. I guess it's actually not easy because obsession never is. But usually what will happen to me is I'll become obsessed with something. I'll become obsessed with like this Twitter thread, or for another piece I made, I became obsessed with subtitles. And what if the subtitles were written by somebody who didn't know what was happening in the film? And like, what would that look like? So obsessed with an idea, and then I researched that idea. I researched like either usually a specific piece of the idea, or do some sort of like, I guess almost it's like a generalist research. So doing a sort of like wide net research of like, well, how are subtitles historically used, and what is the history behind them, and like, why is that? And then also finding pieces where that doesn't happen, that is different from the norm. And then also figuring out my research for the images themselves, which means honestly like spending hours and hours and hours online, watching through old things, usually on archive.org, because they have it's sort of like an Uber collection with a bunch of smaller collections in it. And then once I have pieces like images that are speaking to me and I think are really interesting, and then these ideas that I've been working with, then marrying those two together. And sometimes that just means like throwing all of the pieces into Premiere and pulling snippets and like seeing what works, and just sort of playing around. And sometimes I have a sort of like bigger idea that I'm trying to like fit things to, but you don't have to have that. I think that's one of the things that can be intimidating about making artwork at all, is that you have to know what you want to do at the end. And sometimes you can just be like, I'm going to experiment. My experiment is with color, and I'm going to look for images from the 70s that are orange and red toned, and then I'm going to put them all together and see what's there. So you can also do experiments in that way, which can definitely take the pressure off, and can also definitely give you a new way to look at things. And a lot of times really interesting connections and ideas can come out of that. So I have a little exercise that you can all do. I think we're reaching the end of our time, but I'll go through it really quickly, and then I can give you all my slide deck so that you can use it, or you can take a picture of this or screenshot it. This is something that I do sometimes if I'm stuck, or if I'm trying to figure out like how to work with something that I'm really interested in. So choosing a video or image that you're interested in working with, and writing a paragraph long short story based on that image, making a list of ways this video or image can be manipulated to create new meaning, and then writing a paragraph about what the image means now. I'm a writer and a visual artist, so a lot of my stuff is writing based, which I know not all visual artists love, but it can be really helpful to work out your ideas on paper. And especially short story writing, it's just a paragraph, and you can get a sense of sort of what's coming up for you in the subconscious, about what this thing means. So here are some techniques and exercises that either I use or some of the things we've gone over in this little presentation have used. So this too, feel free to use and draw from. So there's still images, using those to build a narrative, altered and replaced sound, which a bunch of the pieces we watched had, or no sound, which is also fun. Doing a character study, so using archival images, video, and sound to create a piece that shows a character. Working on celluloid, so using paint, pen, scratching, burning, sewing, anything just directly onto physical film. Something else that we didn't get into a lot but that's also super interesting is a multi-channel installation. Those are a lot harder to show in non-physical space, but are very cool if you're doing gallery work. So having two channels, like so two different videos playing at the same time, and then juxtaposing those against each other and seeing the ways in which they interact. And then something else that I think is really interesting that I haven't done a lot of, but I think maybe I should, I don't know, is using your personal archives. So thinking about how you can use your own images, film, video, audio recordings, and really thinking about like what are the larger themes in your own life, and what are sort of the ways that you can make a film that's about you in some way. I know I have a bunch of like little tape recordings from when I was a kid that I've never done anything with, but I was really thinking about the sort of idea of the personal archive too. And I think especially now with everyone being on their phones all the time and taking so many images, like I mean, collectively, we've taken more images in the past, like probably 2 months than anyone took in the previous, I don't know, millennia. So there's just like there's a ton of images out there now, and thinking about what are the ways in which we could use those, I think is also really interesting. I want to give you some extra resources before we go into Q&A, and I can send these to you too. There's an experimental film PDF that another filmmaker put together. Well, it's actually like a collective project. One of the benefits of COVID has been everyone got super bored and put a bunch of content together for everyone else to watch, which is awesome. Monoscope has a sort of a landing page for experimental film that has a lot of links to resources. So if you want to read academic journals about it, or essays, or see some of the films, that's a really cool resource. And then Sentient Art Film has a cool program going on right now that's 1990s Asian American film and video exhibit that's about experimental film from the 90s, which is also very cool. So I wanted to offer you those resources too. And again, I'm happy to share this slide deck with all of you. So don't worry if you can't get them, but also feel free to screenshot. That's basically the end of it. So I would love to talk, answer any questions, or think, hear what people are thinking, or if anyone has anything they want to add.
Yes. I really enjoyed your presentation so much, because until you had broken down what archival material is, this whole world of material, I didn't really understand what you meant. And I liked seeing your examples of when the experiment is obvious. In the case of I'd Like to Thank My Wife, where it becomes like kind of you speaking for what you expect these women to be thinking. It's comedic. Or the LA Experimental Collective with the horror films. It's obvious that that's not a film or a documentary.
Mm-hmm.
However, archival material can be used in documentaries. And my question is, in the case of Sans Soleil, it's kind of more subtle. It's harder to tell that that is an experiment. And so my question is, do you think that there are some experiments that are off limit? Do you think it's the responsibility of the artist to make it known that this isn't historically accurate or documentary? Or is that part of the art and the viewer's responsibility?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think at the time that Chris Marker was making those things, it was fair. It's interesting because it's not obvious in the piece itself as it stands alone, but I think it was more obvious in the context of the time, in the publishing of articles and the talking about it in the sort of like journals of the time, which is very interesting to think about, because we don't really, to that extent, have that same discourse anymore. It's sort of it's like partially in academia, but it's really like sort of blown out of its kind of, it's like academic confines. And I think, I mean, I don't know. I would say, like, if your piece has the potential to be, I mean, I'm just thinking about like misinformation now and the idea of like fake news. And I think if your piece has the potential to like be misconstrued in that way, and you don't want it to because you care about that, yeah, I think it would make sense to tell people at some point. I mean, the thing is, you can also tell people at the end. It doesn't have to be at the beginning and up front. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea. Or is the idea to see like how far your art piece can get? I mean, I think some people are doing work like that, but I think we are essentially on the wild west of the internet. So that's a really tricky one. It's not work that I personally am interested in doing. What other people are doing, and sort of like their own moral issues around it, or non-issues. Some people don't care. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer for you, but I think it's a really interesting question. What responsibility do we have to the viewer to let them know whether or not something is true? Yeah, that's a great one.
I liked your response nonetheless.
I was like, I don't know.
I'll just say thank you. I loved that. Just even from the
Good.
very, very beginning, the experiment, because everything I've done in all of my creative works and in my cultural creativity work is around experimenting. So I love that. Pretty much every single question that popped in my brain, you answered really quickly after it popped in my brain. And then at the end, I was even going to ask like how to get started, like a prompt, and then you gave that. So I'm really excited to take your prompt. I did screenshot it so that I can do something really fun, because it's really just so simple. It's like, just pick anything. And I like to do stuff kind of like roulette, like, you know, like I just flip through a book and then grab that spot and work from there. And so now I kind of want to do that with this prompt of video, and just kind of like Russian roulette, pick something and then see what it invokes in me and change it. So thank you. I don't think I have any questions now, but how do we get in touch with you in case we do? And are you open to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I was like, yeah, send me what you make. I want to see it. I'm going to put my email in the chat. And you can always email me. I love getting emails that are not promotional material.
Awesome.
You know, or like,
thank you.
yeah, that would be really cool. Yeah, I love spreading the good word about making art that's interesting and you like, and it's not super hard.
No, and that's
doesn't
pretty
have
much
to be
what I
hard.
do. I work with nonprofit programs, and I teach kids, and I teach adults how to act like kids. And one of
Ooh,
the
love
things
it.
is just these little prompts so that they can have baby steps and give themselves high fives along the way. So thanks for being one of those people that likes to instigate and help create new art with people. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks for coming and sharing. It's really cool.
My pleasure.
I think you already mentioned one resource, but I was curious what websites you use to find archival video, because I'm always
yeah,
searching, and
you're like, you're into it. I use archive.org. I'm gonna drop a link. I found it to be honestly the best. I've tried looking under if you go to Creative Commons too, they have a couple other archives, but they all feed back to archive.org. So because archive.org has like all of these sub archives within it, which is awesome. I mean, there's also, you could get, I mean, ideally someday I would love to like work with like an archive that didn't have everything online, because I want access to those things. I want everything to be online because I think it's more fun. But archive.org is awesome, and you can search by a ton of different parameters and keep like keywords. Be creative when searching by keywords though, because some people do not keyword their archival stuff well at all. You're like, that's not that's not what this was about. I just watched it. But yeah,
looking in there.
you have to spend a lot of time. I mean, it's great for people who love rabbit holes, which I do. So yeah, I use it all the time. I mean, I used it for my wife's birthday. I like put together a little film festival for her, and I made like a credit sequence and like little interstitials, and I used it for that, and just like found all of these different dancing videos of people dancing, and then like put those over different music, and it was delightful. But yeah, it's great. It's a great resource. And you can also search by copyright and fair use. Yeah, highly recommend.